The wind howled outside, rattling the windows as I stared at the crumbling structure of the old mental hospital. My brother had been gone for nearly 3 years, and his wife, well, she had never quite recovered. She believed something inside that hospital had taken him from her. Tonight, she had convinced me to come with her. She was adamant. There were answers inside, something the doctors had missed. We entered through a side door, the stench of mold and decay hitting us instantly. The walls were peeling, the floors creaking beneath our feet. Old patient files scattered across the ground, abandoned, forgotten. My brother's wife moved quickly, as though she knew where she was going. I followed, uneasy. We reached what appeared to be the ward where my brother had once stayed. The beds were still there, lined up against the walls, rusted and broken. In the far corner, a single bed remained untouched, its sheets neatly folded. It was as if someone had been expecting us. "That's where he was," she whispered, pointing at the bed. Her voice trembled. "He used to tell me there was someone else in here with him, but the doctors said it was just his mind playing tricks." I moved closer to the bed. There was something off about it, a coldness that seemed to radiate from the mattress. I glanced at her, but she was focused, staring at the empty bed. Then we heard it, a faint scraping sound, like nails on metal. I turned quickly, but nothing was there. My heart raced as the noise grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the wall behind the bed. Without a word, she walked toward the wall and began to claw at it with her bare hands. "He's in here. I know it," she muttered. I rushed to stop her, but as soon as my hand touched her arm, the wall shifted. It wasn't a wall, it was a door, a hidden door, blending seamlessly with the cracked plaster. We stood there for a moment, unsure. Slowly she reached for the handle, her fingers trembling. She opened it, revealing a small, dark room. Inside, the smell of decay was overwhelming. In the center of the room lay a body, its face obscured by a thick layer of dust. My throat tightened as I realized it was my brother. The doctors had told us he died of natural causes, but here he was, his body hidden away, as if someone had tried to erase his existence. My brother's wife fell to her knees, sobbing. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. And then the scraping sound began again, this time louder, closer. The walls around us seemed to groan, as if the entire building was alive, reacting to the discovery. Suddenly the door behind us slammed shut. We were trapped. The air grew colder, and I could feel a presence in the room. It wasn't just the decaying body of my brother. It was something else, something angry. I grabbed her arm and tried to pull her toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. A voice, barely a whisper, filled the room. "You should have left him here." It was not my brother's voice. It was something far older, far darker. I could feel it moving closer, circling us. Desperation surged through me. I threw my weight against the door, and finally, it gave way. We stumbled out, slamming it behind us. The scraping noise stopped, but the air still felt heavy, suffocating. We ran, not stopping until we were outside, gasping for breath. The hospital loomed behind us, silent once more. But I knew, whatever was inside, it wasn't finished. My brother had been a part of something we couldn't understand, and now, so were we. I had always been drawn to abandoned places. The quiet, the isolation, the stories locked away in the crumbling walls, they fascinated me. So when I heard about the old mental hospital on the edge of town, I knew I had to see it for myself. It was said to have been abandoned for over 50 years. The last patients moved out abruptly, leaving everything behind. No one ever spoke about why. I arrived just before sunset, hoping to capture the eerie beauty of the place as the light faded. The building was massive, its windows broken, its facade cracked and covered in vines. But something about it felt alive. I wandered through the empty hallways, my footsteps echoing. Old wheelchairs sat rusting in corners, and patient records were scattered across the floor. It was easy to imagine the place as it had once been, filled with people lost in their own minds, their cries and whispers lingering in the air. I entered what must have been the main ward. The walls were lined with small rooms, each with a single bed and a heavy door that could be locked from the outside. I shivered, imagining the kind of isolation these patients must have felt. As I stepped into one of the rooms, I noticed something strange. A journal lying on the bed, untouched by time. I picked it up, flipping through the yellowed pages. It belonged to a patient named Edward, admitted in 1943. His handwriting was shaky, his words disjointed. But what struck me most were the final entries. They spoke of voices, whispers that wouldn't stop, even when he was alone. Edward wrote about the doctors, how they didn't believe him, how they said it was just in his head. But he knew. He knew the voices were real. As I read, I felt a chill creep down my spine. The room seemed to grow darker, colder. I glanced at the door. It was still open, but the hallway beyond was cloaked in shadow. I forced myself to continue reading, but the words on the page no longer made sense. They were jumbled, smeared, as though written in a frenzy. Then I heard it, a whisper, faint but unmistakable. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The journal slipped from my hands, falling to the floor with a soft thud. The whisper came again, louder this time, closer. I turned, but the room was empty. The door swung slightly, creaking as if moved by an unseen hand. I tried to leave, but my legs felt heavy, as if rooted to the spot. The whispering grew louder, surrounding me. It wasn't just one voice, it was many, overlapping, indistinct. I clapped my hands over my ears, trying to block them out, but it was no use. The voices were inside my head now. I stumbled out of the room, my vision blurring. The hallway stretched before me, endless. Doors slammed shut on their own, the sound reverberating through the building. Panic surged through me as I ran, but no matter how far I went, the whispers followed. Finally, I reached the exit. I burst outside, gasping for air. The whispers stopped, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. I looked back at the hospital, its windows dark and empty. But I knew the voices were still there, waiting. I never went back, but sometimes, late at night, I can still hear them, faint whispers at the edge of my consciousness, reminding me that the past is never truly gone. My aunt had always been a strong woman, but after her son's death, something in her broke. She blamed herself, though no one else did. In her grief, she became obsessed with the idea that he wasn't really gone, that he was trapped somewhere, waiting for her to find him. One evening she called me, her voice shaky. "I know where he is," she said. "I need you to come with me." I didn't ask questions. I knew better. She had always been a bit eccentric, but this was different. Desperation had taken hold of her. We drove out to the old mental hospital on the outskirts of town. I hadn't been there in years, not since I was a child, and my parents had warned me to stay away. My aunt was convinced that her son had somehow ended up there, despite the fact that the place had been abandoned for decades. The building loomed ahead, its windows shattered, the doors hanging off their hinges. We entered through a side door, the darkness swallowing us as we stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, the floorboards creaking beneath our feet. "He's here," my aunt whispered, her voice barely audible. She moved through the hallways with purpose, as though she knew exactly where to go. I followed, my stomach twisting with unease. We reached a room at the far end of the hospital, a room that looked no different from the others. But to my aunt, it was significant. She stood in the doorway, staring at the empty bed. "This was his room," she said softly. "I know it." I didn't understand. Her son had never been here. He had never even been near this place. But she was convinced. She knelt by the bed, running her fingers along the cold metal frame. "I can feel him," she murmured. Then the temperature in the room dropped. I shivered, glancing around, trying to shake off the sudden chill. My aunt didn't seem to notice. She was too focused on the bed, her eyes wide, her breathing shallow. Suddenly the door slammed shut. The sound echoed through the empty halls, and my heart raced. I rushed to the door, but it wouldn't open. No matter how hard I pulled, it stayed firmly shut. My aunt didn't move. She just sat there, staring at the bed, her lips moving in silent prayer. Then I heard it, a soft crying. At first I thought it was my aunt, but when I turned to look at her, her face was blank, her eyes vacant. The crying grew louder, filling the room. It sounded like a child, sobbing, lost. My aunt's voice broke the silence. "He's here," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "He's finally here." I didn't know what to do. The crying was unbearable now, filling every corner of the room, as if the walls themselves were weeping. I screamed for help, banging on the door, but no one came. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the crying stopped. The room was silent. My aunt stood, her face calm, peaceful even. She turned to me, smiling through her tears. "He's free now," she said softly. The door creaked open, and we left the room in silence. My aunt never spoke of that night again, and I never asked. But I knew. Whatever had been in that room, whatever had kept her son trapped there, was finally gone.
My nephew had been sick for months, and no one could figure out what was wrong. His symptoms were strange: fits of screaming, sudden fevers, and most disturbingly, he would speak in a voice that wasn't his own. It was as if something had taken hold of him, something none of us could explain. Desperate for answers, I started researching the history of our town, looking for anything that might provide a clue. That's when I came across an old article about the mental hospital, specifically about a ward that had been closed off after a series of unexplained deaths. The patients there had exhibited similar symptoms to my nephew: violent outbursts, uncontrollable fevers, and sudden changes in personality. I didn't believe in the paranormal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was a connection. I convinced my sister to let me take my nephew to the hospital, hoping that somehow we might find answers. The hospital was as eerie as I had imagined: abandoned, decaying, and filled with an oppressive silence. I carried my nephew through the dark hallways, his small body limp in my arms. He had been quiet for hours, his fever spiking dangerously high. We reached the ward mentioned in the article, the doors sealed shut with heavy chains. I broke the lock, pushing the door open with a sense of dread. The room beyond was cold, unnaturally so. Old hospital beds lined the walls, their metal frames rusted and broken. The air was thick with the smell of damp and decay. As I placed my nephew on one of the beds, his eyes fluttered open. He looked around the room, his expression dazed. Then, without warning, he sat up straight, his eyes wide with terror. "They're here," he whispered, his voice low and trembling. I looked around, but the room was empty. "Who's here?" I asked, my heart pounding. He pointed to the far corner, his finger trembling. "The doctors, they're coming for me." A cold breeze swept through the room, and I felt a presence, something watching us. My nephew began to scream, his body convulsing violently. I tried to hold him, but he was too strong, thrashing wildly. Then the lights flickered, and for a brief moment I saw them, figures in white coats, their faces pale and gaunt. They moved silently, their eyes fixed on my nephew. I backed away, fear gripping me. The figures surrounded the bed, their hands reaching out to touch him. He screamed louder, his body arching in pain. I tried to push them away, but my hands passed right through them. They weren't solid. They were shadows of the past, echoes of something that had once been. Suddenly, the room grew impossibly cold, and I felt a sharp pain in my chest, as if something was pulling the air from my lungs. I fell to my knees, gasping for breath. My nephew's screams echoed in my ears, but I couldn't move. Then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The figures vanished, and the room was silent once more. I looked up to see my nephew lying still on the bed, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. I rushed to his side, checking for a pulse. He was alive, but barely. I scooped him up in my arms and ran from the hospital, never looking back. That night, my nephew's fever broke, and by morning, he was back to his old self. The doctors were baffled by his sudden recovery, but I knew the truth. Something had been holding him captive, something dark and ancient, and though we had escaped the hospital, I feared that whatever it was might still be watching.
I've always had a fascination with abandoned places. There's something about the silence and decay that draws me in. When I heard about the old mental hospital on the outskirts of town, I knew I had to explore it. People whispered about the place, claiming it was haunted, that anyone who stayed there too long would go mad. I didn't believe in any of that, of course. To me, it was just another forgotten relic of the past. One evening, I decided to go there alone. I packed my flashlight, some snacks, and a crowbar, just in case any doors were stuck. I arrived at the hospital just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement and ivy-covered walls. The building was massive, its windows dark and empty, like staring into the eyes of something that had long since lost its soul. The main entrance was boarded up, but I found a side door that had been left slightly ajar, probably by other explorers or squatters. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it, the heavy oppressive air that seemed to cling to the walls. The smell of mold, dust, and something faintly metallic hung in the air. It was unsettling, but I pushed the feeling aside. After all, it was just an old building. I clicked on my flashlight and began wandering through the halls. The floor creaked beneath my feet, and every now and then I'd hear the distant drip of water from somewhere deeper inside. Old wheelchairs and gurneys were scattered around, some overturned as if abandoned in a hurry. Faded signs hung crookedly on the walls, pointing toward different wards. Admissions, rehabilitation, psychiatric intensive care. I passed them without much thought, until I came across something that stopped me in my tracks. It was a heavy iron door at the end of a narrow hallway. Unlike the others, this one was still intact, locked with a thick padlock that was rusted but sturdy. Above the door, a small faded plaque read, "Ward C, Restricted Access." Curiosity gnawed at me. I had read about Ward C in old newspaper clippings, stories about how the most disturbed patients were kept there, isolated from the rest of the hospital. There had been rumors of experiments, treatments that bordered on torture. The ward had been sealed off years before the hospital finally closed, and no one ever spoke of it again. I couldn't resist. I pulled out the crowbar from my bag and wedged it between the lock and the door. It took several tries, but the lock finally snapped with a loud crack that echoed down the empty halls. I hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open, its hinges groaning as if protesting after years of disuse. Inside, the air was colder, unnaturally so. My breath misted in front of me as I stepped into the dimly lit corridor. This part of the hospital was different. The walls were lined with heavy metal doors, each with a small barred window. Some of the doors had been left slightly ajar, revealing dark, empty cells inside. Others were locked tight, their windows blackened as though whatever had been inside had long since decayed. As I moved down the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't just the usual unease I felt in abandoned places. This was different, more intense. I stopped in front of one of the locked doors, peering through the bars into the darkness beyond. For a moment I saw nothing but shadows, but then something moved, a faint shuffling sound, like someone or something was inside. I leaned closer, straining to see through the gloom. My heart skipped a beat when I realized there was a figure in the corner of the room. At first I thought it was a mannequin, left behind as some kind of cruel joke. But then it moved again, its head slowly turning toward me. I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my hands and clattering to the floor. The figure stood up. It wasn't fast or violent, just a slow, deliberate motion, like it had been waiting for me. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. I scrambled to pick up my flashlight, my fingers trembling as I fumbled to turn it back on. When the light finally flickered to life, the cell was empty. The figure was gone, as if it had never been there at all, but the door was still locked. I shone the light around, searching for any sign of movement, but the room was completely empty. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. My logical mind tried to explain it away. Maybe it had been a trick of the light, my imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I decided it was time to leave. Whatever curiosity had driven me here was quickly being replaced by a growing sense of dread. I turned to head back down the hallway, but something stopped me in my tracks. The door I had entered through was now closed. I walked toward it, my steps quickening. When I reached it, I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I yanked harder, but it felt like something was holding it shut from the other side. Panic started to set in. I banged on the door, calling out, but my voice echoed hollowly in the empty corridor. Then I heard it, a soft whisper, so quiet I almost thought I had imagined it. It was coming from behind me. I turned slowly, my flashlight sweeping the hallway, but there was no one there. The whisper came again, this time louder, more insistent. It was coming from one of the locked cells. I backed away, my pulse racing. The whisper grew louder, more voices joining in, overlapping and blending into a cacophony of sound. I clapped my hands over my ears, but the noise seemed to penetrate my skull, vibrating in my bones. Suddenly the lights flickered, and for a brief moment, the hallway was plunged into darkness. When the lights came back on, I saw them. Figures standing in the shadows, their faces obscured, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. They stood motionless, watching me, waiting. I stumbled backward, my legs barely able to carry me as I tried to get away. The door toward C slammed shut with a deafening crash, trapping me inside. I was alone with them now. The whispering stopped, replaced by a low, rhythmic chanting. The figures began to move toward me, slow and deliberate, like they had all the time in the world. My body went numb, frozen in place by some unseen force. I couldn't scream, couldn't move, couldn't think. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The figures vanished, the door creaked open, and the hallway was silent once more. I bolted, not caring where I was going, just needing to get out. I ran through the winding corridors, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness until I finally reached the exit. I didn't stop running until I was back at my car, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The hospital stood silent behind me, its dark windows watching as I sped away, never looking back. I don't know what I saw that night, and I don't want to know. All I know is that Ward C had been sealed for a reason, and I was lucky to get out alive. My stepfather had always been a practical man. He didn't believe in the supernatural, dismissed ghost stories as nonsense, and found the idea of haunted places laughable. So, when he got a job as a night security guard at the old mental hospital, he wasn't worried about the rumors that surrounded the place. To him it was just another job, an easy paycheck for walking empty halls during the night. But something changed after he started working there. He didn't talk much about the hospital at first, just came home tired, said the place was quiet and boring. But as the weeks went on, he became more withdrawn, more irritable. At night, he would wake up drenched in sweat, muttering to himself about things he couldn't quite explain. He'd brush it off, claiming it was just stress. But I knew something was wrong. One night, he came home looking worse than I'd ever seen him. His face was pale, his hands shaking as he fumbled with his keys. I asked him what happened, but he didn't answer, just muttered something about them and disappeared into his room. The next morning, he quit his job. It took a while, but eventually he told me what happened that night. And I wish he hadn't, because after hearing his story, I could never look at that hospital the same way again. It had started like any other night. He arrived at the hospital just before midnight, walking his usual route through the empty corridors, checking doors and making sure everything was locked up. The place was eerily quiet, as it always was, with only the faint hum of the old electrical systems breaking the silence. But as the night wore on, he began to notice something strange. It started with small things. Doors that he knew he had locked would be standing open when he walked by again. Lights would flicker, even though the building's power had long been unreliable. Then came the voices. At first, it was just a faint murmuring, like someone talking in the distance. He chalked it up to the wind, or maybe the old pipes creaking. But as the hours passed, the voices grew louder, more distinct. He could hear words now, whispers in the dark, just beyond the edge of his hearing. He tried to ignore it, continued making his rounds, but the voices followed him, growing louder with each step. He stopped in front of one of the old sealed-off wards, Ward E. The door was rusted shut, padlocked and chained, but from behind it, he could hear the unmistakable sound of someone crying. His heart pounded as he stood there, listening. It was a woman's voice, soft and sorrowful, like she was pleading for help. He didn't want to investigate. He had no reason to, but something pulled him toward the door, a compulsion he couldn't explain. He hesitated for a moment before unlocking the padlock and pushing the door open. The room beyond was pitch dark, the air inside cold and stale. He shone his flashlight around, revealing old, rusted hospital beds, their mattresses torn and rotting. The crying had stopped. He stepped inside, his breath visible in the freezing air. The room was silent now, except for the soft creak of the floorboards beneath his feet. He scanned the room again, but there was no one there, just the decaying remains of what had once been. But then, as he turned to leave, he heard it again, the crying. This time, it was louder, closer, coming from the far corner of the room. His flashlight flickered, and for a split second, he saw her. A woman, standing in the corner, her face hidden behind long, matted hair. She was wearing what looked like an old hospital gown, her arms hanging limply at her sides. He froze, his flashlight flickering again. The woman didn't move, didn't make a sound. She just stood there, her body swaying slightly, as if caught in some invisible breeze. Then she raised her head and he saw her face. Pale, gaunt, her eyes wide and hollow. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out, only the soft, gasping sobs of someone who had been crying for far too long. He backed away, his hands shaking, but the door slammed shut behind him. He tried the handle, but it was stuck, as if something was holding it closed from the other side. The woman took a step forward, her bare feet silent on the cold floor. He could feel the temperature dropping, the air around him growing so cold it hurt to breathe. The flashlight died completely, plunging him into darkness. For what felt like an eternity, he stood there, trapped in the blackness, his back pressed against the door. He could hear her breathing now, ragged and shallow, as if she was standing right in front of him. He didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound, and then just as suddenly, the door flew open, and he stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air. The hospital was silent again, the voices gone, the crying stopped. But he didn't wait to see if it would start again. He ran, leaving his flashlight behind, and never looked back. When he finished telling me the story, I could see the fear still lingering in his eyes. He wasn't a man who scared easily, but whatever had happened in that hospital had changed him. And even now, years later, he still won't talk about it again. That old hospital may be just a building to some, but for him, and now for me, it's something far darker, something that should have stayed forgotten.